kind of the last thing we discussed was applications of cellular respiration, or not the last thing we discussed. The last thing I'm going to discuss today, because it was the last thing I wrote down, is going back to the very first thing we picked up on for this next exam, and that's the applications of cellular respiration. And the reason for that is kind of because it pertains to really, the most important thing in my life, and that's essentially glucose regulation, right? We talked a lot about dieting and essentially how it can be really complicated, and essentially the jury is still out. We talked about the Nutritional Science Initiative and so forth when we discussed that. The jury's still out on essentially the best way to regulate dietary intake. One day you hear something crazy about one thing you're not supposed to eat, the next day can be different. So essentially, dieting all boils down to caloric restriction and metabolism, right? And that all essentially starts off with glucose. We learned all about cellular respiration and how it begins with glycolysis. And essentially, we learned about how vitamin B is key for making coenzyme A, which is a part of, the transition reaction in cellular respiration before the Krebs cycle. We also talked about NAD and FAD, which are just these electron carrier molecules, also derivatives of vitamin B. So essentially just adding some context to why we see these things in a number of nutritional products. We see tons of vitamin B in energy products because essentially, they're advertising that that's a limiting factor in your ability to metabolize, essentially, right? So if you don't have enough vitamin B, you can't create enough electron carrier molecules, you can't perform cellular respiration at the most effective way possible. We talked a ton about different supplements as well, right? Some of the more interesting ones for people are things like creatine, right? So creatine is just essentially just a shortcut to generating ATP, which is like what we do at the end of the electron transport chain. That's where our big payoff is, at least for ATP, right? And then we talked about things like Hoodia, just appetite suppressants and so forth. But essentially what we're just trying to do is reduce our caloric intake if you're interested in accomplishing the main goal that most diets are supposed to, and that's just weight loss, right? So if that is not some type of goal, then it obviously not important at all, right? But creatine can be useful because it can generate ATP, which is useful for exercise and so forth. And we talked about the most effective product for all of this, and that's Ally, right? And Ally just prevents the absorption of fat in your small intestine. So, absorption of fat. I know it's disastrous to read, right? Creatine, shortcut to ATP, right? So just some of the more important supplements that we discussed. Those were the ones that people had questions on in class, if I vaguely recall, right? But essentially all this boils down to glucose, right? And glucose production. And most of the people that we know do this automatically, right? We have a pancreas that secretes insulin to actually deal with glucose. How does it work, right? We have a cell, and then we have some cell floating around the body, right? We have a receptor for insulin, and then, if you can remember, going back to cell transport, essentially we have a sugar tunnel, right? So we have insulin floating around the body when you eat a meal, and your pancreas produces this insulin in the beta cells of your pancreas, and then it just lands right here on the cell, which opens up this sugar tunnel, and then whatever, we can draw some stars for sugar, and sugar is brought in to perform cellular respiration. Now, if your pancreas doesn't do this properly, like in diabetics, you have to inject this, right? You're just injecting these little triangles that land on the insulin receptor that open up the sugar tunnel and allow sugar to come in. You have to inject it, usually with every meal, right? And usually you also have to have an injection to kind of stabilize your blood sugar, as you have some other ways to get sugar into these cells, which we won't go into because it's a little overly complicated, right? So diabetes. Type 1 diabetics, like my beautiful little girl, do not have the ability to produce insulin because of a random mutation. There's actually like 50 genes involved with this, but I tend to oversimplify it so people actually remember what I'm talking about. Random mutation in one of their immune system genes causes their immune system to attack the pancreatic cells that make this, right? That make insulin. So now they no longer have insulin land on the cell surface, which opens up the sugar tunnel and allows sugar to come in here. Hence all the injections. Now, type 2s have a different problem. As a result of overexposure, these receptors on the surface of the cell, they start to get overly exhausted. Maybe they change shape. We can think of it that way, right? And now you can no longer fit this insulin into here, and half the cells in your body no longer import insulin because you've essentially burnt out these cell surface receptors from eating either gorging too often or eating sugar as too much, primarily a form of your diet, or a huge possibility, which is why one of the more offensive things about that people think about type 2 diabetics is this: they always had a poor diet. No, maybe they had a normal diet, but they happened to have receptors that are much more sensitive to damage, right? Maybe they just ate like just you and I, but their receptors were more sensitive to damage, and hence they ended up with type 2 diabetes, right? Either way, both of these individuals have to take injections to try and get insulin, because no longer in type 2s, you need more insulin to try and search for cells that have receptors that aren't burnt out. Type 1s, they don't make any insulin at all, right? So you have to inject this. But type 1s don't have a problem with their receptor. They have a problem with their pancreas. Type 2s have a problem with their receptor and not their pancreas. So remember, both of these individuals are trying to keep their blood sugar in a certain range. Normal healthy range is between 80 and 150 milligrams per deciliter. You don't need to know the units on this, but you need to know the range, right? People need to be between 80 and 150. Every healthy human, most people on the planet, are between this range naturally, thank goodness, to their pancreas all the time, right? Now, if you're a diabetic, you can end up at 200 at some point, 300, 400, 500, 600, right? Which makes you, according to all the literature I've read, makes you feel crazy, as you might imagine. If you go too low, it can be extremely dangerous because low blood sugar can cause your body to shut down, and so forth. So low blood sugar, hypoglycemia; high blood sugar, hyperglycemia, which kind of makes sense, right? And diabetics have to check to make sure they're trying to stay in this range as close as possible throughout the day with what we call a glucometer. So essentially, all of this. Oh, one more thing. Gestational diabetes, right? Some women, when they're pregnant, develop gestational diabetes, and they have a hard time staying in this range too. It's way more complicated, going back to this mechanism gestational diabetes is, so we're not going to look at that. Oh! I dropped my camera. So, in any case, gestational diabetes is way more complicated at the cellular level. We won't go into that, but just know they're trying to stay in the same level, right? Now, to stay on that level, you're using a glucometer. That means pricking your fingers 12, 15 times a day, right? They have these things called continuous glucose monitors too, but they have an entirely separate set of problems. So, all of this going back to our body's ability to regulate glucose intake, whether it be, not having enough vitamin B to maximize the efficiency of our metabolism and conducting cellular respiration, or because of some genetic anomaly that you develop a disease where your pancreas no longer functions because your immune system attacked it, or because you have had some kind of overexposure in your receptors and they no longer function. All of this, all going back to glucose and its regulation inside of your body, right? So there's a lot more to sugar than I think a whole lot of people realize. Good God, sorry. I'm going to make you guys nauseous with all this movement. The tripod keeps falling down. Anyways, applications of cellular respiration. Last thing we'll cover. Hopefully you guys will get a really good overview of the things that you need to look at. Best of luck.